first night the sea turned lavender, I found a letter under my door. It was folded like a tide line, salt thin and soft. My name breathed across the paper, ink swelling like dusk. The hallway lantern hummed, a warm moth heartbeat. Outside, the shore unspooled its quiet silver, and the dunes leaned closer. I opened the letter with careful thumbs, and the page sighed like a shell. Inside were 6 words, and each word tasted like rain. Meet me where the tide folds. I had never been invited by water, but the night carried a patient kindness. I put on my old cardigan, sea thread clinging at the elbows. I followed the footpath past the fig trees and past the postal boxes that sing in wind. At the dunes, I paused, listening for a voice that might belong to tide. Only the sandpipers trilled, like needles stitching a hem. The shoreline waited with its patient library, each with another page returning. Up beyond the shoal, a lantern bobbed, faint as a hell breath. The moon was a porcelain saucer, balanced on the dark cupboard of sky. I walked until my soles met foam, and the foam recited my grandfather's lullaby. I felt the letter again in my pocket, warm as if held by another hand. She arrived like the hush after page turning, thin scarf trailing a sentence behind her. Her dress was the color of faded kelp, with buttons like wet pearls. She did not speak at first, and the silence felt kindly. We faced the water together, letting its small grammar wash our ankles. At last she said, "Thank you for reading me." I asked her name, because names are small boats. She smiled in a way that warmed the tide, like tea steeping in porcelain. "Call me Maris," she said, as if setting a cup on a saucer. We shook hands, and the water tugged once at our wrists. The tug felt like punctuation, firm and tender. I told her I restored old letters, pressing them flat with glass and patience. The town brings me attic boxes, and the boxes bring me dust. Some envelopes keep moths, some keep confessions. She listened the way a horizon listens, empty enough to hold everything. Then she laughed softly, and the tide laughed too. We walked the length of the cove, trading small histories like shells. She once taught children to float on their backs, counting constellations they could not name. I once mended a postcard so gently, its ink turned sweet. Maurice tilted her head, listening to my words arrive. When the breeze quickened, she touched my sleeve like a bookmark. We reached the jetty with its slow-talking stones, and sat where gnats dream on nails. Boats tipped their chins, and egrets practiced white cursive. Maurice looked at my pocket, where the letters slept. She asked if times can write, or if we teach them. I said the sea writes in salt, and salt remembers we are water. She placed a small bottle on the plank, green as the shell of thought. Inside lay a scrap of linen, threaded with one silver hair. I carried this for a year, she said, waiting for the right reader. I asked if she meant me, and the lanterns on the boats nodded. Open it when waves turn violet again, she whispered, or when you feel unmoored. The violet returned like a memory finding its chair, soft and inevitable. I uncorked the bottle, and the air smelled of lilac and rope. The linen unfolded like a tide chart, edges kissed by mercury light. Stitched across the weave, a message curved like a gull's wing. It read, every shore is a mouth learning to say stay. Maurice watched my lips shape the sentence, and she exhaled like a harbor after storm. We sat without adding anything, because some sentences are full. The egrets scolded themselves into parentheses, and dust placed its fingers to its lips. I felt the town behind us breathe, torches inhaling citron and bread. In the days that followed, letters began arriving like tide pools. They slid beneath my door at dawn, sometimes damp as if shy. Some were blank except for a comma, which glowed gently. Some carried small seeds of moonlight that sprouted in my tea. Each envelope taught me a new silence, and each silence felt medicinal. I met Maurice by the jetty every evening, while the sky practiced new pastels. We did not always talk, because listening can be language. She would gather sea glass like mislaid verbs, rubbing them until they gleamed. I brought a satchel of rescued ink and drew maps of our pauses. Once, she tugged a pale shard behind my ear. You keep the light now, she said, so the letters find you faster. The town noticed our gentle ritual, but offered only nods. Old fishermen left oranges on the jetty, as if priding luck. Children chalked the boardwalk with tiny doorways, which opened when gulls laughed. The baker began shaping loaves like envelopes, hiding rosemary inside. When compressed breath. One afternoon, a storm rehearsed above the cape, and thunder arranged its furniture. The first raindrops landed like stamps, approved in blue. Maurice and I hurried beneath the boathouse, where ropes slept in hanks. The rain formed slender strings between beams, harp lines we could not play. She leaned close enough for me to smell salt apples, and the hush pressed our shoulders. I asked who first wrote her, and why the sea keeps answering. She traced a knot with one finger, and my question uncoiled. There was a lighthouse once, she said, with a keeper who conversed with fog. He whispered into bottles, then returned them to weather. The bottles learned our names and delivered us to each other. I pictured the keeper like a patient comma, pausing so others could breathe. The storm softened to a kind rain, and the ropes began to steam. Maurice set her head on my shoulder, light as a folded note. I closed my eyes to listen properly, counting the rests between thunder. When the rain grew shy, we stepped back into the day. We found the lighthouse by following a rumor, which is a soft thread. It stood on a point like a careful finger, guiding grammar home. Its door was open, patient as a porch. Inside, dust moved in shafts like slow snow, and the stairs circled as if thinking. We climbed until our breath turned ribboned, and then we stood with the lens. The lens had been polished by centuries of longing, and it held a faint vanilla heat. Mari spoke her name into its heart, and her syllables gloomed. I whispered mine after hers, and the sound braided like seagrass. The room brightened without light, as if meaning itself had windows. For a long moment we did nothing, which felt like perfect work. We descended and found a drawer of maps, edges furred with salt. Each map had no place names, only verbs and tides. On one chart a dotted line moved softly, then settled at our cove. At the dot a tiny note said, "Right here if you wish to stay." Maurice looked at me as if I were harbor, and I looked at her as if I were finally water. That evening the town bells stitched a quiet seam, and the shore opened its mouth. We returned to the jetty with soft hearts, like fruit handled well. I brought my grandmother's pen, polished by patience. Maurice brought the green bottle, as if bringing a well. We sat knee to knee, and the waves practiced saying stay. I wrote a first letter on the wind, which is the tenderest paper. sealed the bottle. The boats lifted like attentive shoulders. Maurice kissed the glass with a shy breath, and my name grew warmer inside. We set it adrift together, palms releasing in time with foam. The bottle swam toward the violet seam, small and brave. Around us, the town exhaled, and night stitched itself to the hem of sleep. The bottle vanished into velvet water, and our hands found stillness. Wind folded itself beneath the dock, humming a promise. Maurice leaned on my shoulder, and the lantern spoke in amber vowels. I felt the town at our backs, a quilt of porches and patient clocks. Somewhere a screen door agreed quietly, and the sea kept treating us. Morning brought a letter with a faint citrus edge, as if peeled from sunlight. It waited by my cuddle like a polite guest, dry as bone. When I opened it, steam from the spout arranged itself into cursive. The message asked for a reply in chalk on the low black rock near the steps. Bring one memory, if added, but carry it softly. I chose the memory of my mother's tin box, where feathers slept. She kept notes folded inside them, so the words would remember air. I walked to the black rock before noon, chalk cupped like an egg. The tide was out and thinking slowly, and ghosts argued in friendly italics. I wrote about the tin box, how the lid squeaked and blessed. The letters held, even when spray kissed them. Maurice appeared with her palms full of sky glass, pale and rounded. She read the chalk the way one reads pulse, eyes attentive and warm. She placed a shard on each corner, painting the memory like a gentle map. Then she spoke of her grandmother's oar, worn thin by telling. They used it to stir soups in winter, so voyages would enter the broth. We spent afternoons visiting small places that collect time and let it breathe. At the post office, a sparrow nested in box 12, pushing stamps aside. The clerk whispered please and thank you to envelopes and tied them with blue. At the pier, a boy sold nuts for pocket wishes, labeled by weather. We bought a fair wind knot, then tucked it into our silence. At dusk we learned the first grammar of sting, which is patience. We named our pauses like islands on a chart, shallow and kind. We practiced standing very near, without disturbing the sentences between us. Sometimes Maurice would hum a lighthouse note, low and round. My ribs answered by opening a little, as if windows. One evening the sea returned inside lay a map with no ink, only a faint salt lattice. We held it against the sky and waited until the pattern agreed to show. It revealed a narrow path behind the bakery, lined with fennel and bells. At the end a door rested in dune grass, unhinged but listening. We carried the door to the quietest part of shore and leaned it upright. On one side the world smelled of bread and rope, soft and known. On the other side heat drifted like peach skins, and a far bell sighed. Maurice pressed her ear to the wood and smiled, as if greeted by cousins. She asked if I wished to visit the between, for only a few breaths. We stepped through with our hands lightly joined, palms careful. The air there tasted of tangerine ink and moth wing. A beach unspooled in astonished blue, mirroring our cove but younger. No footprints waited for us, so we walked like librarians. Clowns practiced gentle architecture, leaning toward arches and bridges. A figure waved from a distance like a slow metronome, steady and kind. It was the keeper with bottle-bright eyes and a coat smelling of rain. He welcomed us as if we were long words, deserving space. He said letters travel between shores that rhyme, and hearts learn a pattern. He asked what we sought, and we said only staying. He poured tea from a kettle that remembered fog and patience. Each cup cooled to reveal a single readable ring, like tree age. Mine said, listen longer than you speak, even to quiet. Maurice's ring said, share the oar, even in shallow water. We nodded like small boats, tethered and calm. The keeper showed us a library of sealed weather, shelved by mood. There were jars of first snow and last heat, and jars of almost rain. He let us open a jar of evening hush, which smelled of wool and ink. He asked us to carry it back to our shore, for nights that forget how to soften. We agreed with our hands, and he believed us. When we returned through the door, the world felt tuned, one notch kinder. We set the jar on my windowsill beside rosemary and an old stamp. In the street a cat announced moonrise with velvet certainty, tail like a pen. Maurice touched my wrist just above the pulse, as if measuring tide. Stay, she breathed, and the word chose a home. Days braided themselves into a soft rope, useful and sweet. We kept the lighthouse clean of rusted syllables and polished its brats. We mended nets at the jetty and listened for commas, hiding in brought us questions about sharks and love, and we answered with tide tables. The baker invented a loaf named Harbor, which forgave any knife. One noon the sea went glass quiet, as if holding a thought. A procession of bottles arrived shoulder to shoulder, clinking politely. They nudged the sand with a sound like sleep, and waited. Each held the name written like a tide curl, soft and sure. Some names belonged to our town, some to shores we had never met. We gathered neighbors and set a long table of planks and crates. We opened each bottle with a blessing and a listening. When a name matched a heart, eyes warmed like lantern wicks. When a name traveled further, we sent it with orange bread and ribbons. The beach learned to speak gently in many directions, and we learned with it. At twilight, an empty bottle rolled to my shoe, fried with patience. Inside was only a curl-driven of violet light, soft as breath. I held it up and watched the dusk lean closer, curious and kind. Maurice touched the glass with 2 fingers, and a door shake glimmered in the foam. It was the old door again, but now it faced inward. I understood in the slow way water understands stone, patient and exact. The door asked for the story of my house, room by room. We walked back with evening on our shoulders and let the door rest in the hall. I spoke first about the kitchen window and its lavender, how it had its light. I spoke of the table that belongs to postcards and tea. Maurice told the door about the chair she carries from shore to shore. It is made from driftwood and moon, she said softly. She described sleeping there during long summers, when dreams learn tides. The door listened like a relative who refuses hurry, and smiled in grain. Then it showed us the hinge bright as a starling, ready to be set. We fixed the hinge with screws that remembered lullabies, turning slowly. The door settled into the frame like a checked heartbeat, then breathed. When we closed it gently, the house exhaled a shy relief. Walls learned the difference between echo and company, and chose company. Outside, the tide folded closer to the steps, as if welcoming us home. Night gave us a new ritual made from whisper weather and small light. We placed a letter on the threshold before sleep, sealed with rosemary. In the morning it returned with one gentle correction, never unkind. Our words learned to place their feet carefully, like waiters. We gave thanks to comets for their work, and into silence for its stitching. On a day of pearly drizzle, the keeper arrived in town, hat bowed. He asked us to come to the pointed moonrise for a naming. We brought the fair wind knot in the jar of hush and followed. At the lantern room he set a brass plaque the size of a palm, warm to touch. It bore no letters, only a polished pause. "This is for your harbor," he said, "and for the letters that fold like tides. Let the light walk softly between shores and return what is needed." We placed the plaque near the lens and stood quietly, hands joined. The room warmed the way bread warms, slow and generous. The sea answered with a violet ribbon across its lip, bright and forgiving. The violet ribbon lingered like a kindness that forgets to leave, and we let our breaths match it. Maris rested her palm on the plaque, and the brass held her warmth. I felt something name itself inside my chest, quiet as a shorebird. We walked down the stairs in slow spirals, carrying the hush like a lantern. The town slept in small lamps and sailor snores, soft and sincere. We passed windows where fern leaves practiced shadow grammar, graceful and precise. At my door the threshold waited for its letter, patient as will. Maris wrote 3 words on rosemary steam, and the steam remembered. I added a comma that felt like an armchair, inviting and steady. Morning buttered the street with pale light, and gulls signed their names. Our letter had returned wearing a tiny ribbon of drift, salt bright. It suggested we borrow an hour from low tide and spend it kindly. We folded the hour between us like a shawl and stepped into the day. The air tasted of pear and rope, a breakfast for staying. We visited the tailor who hems weather and mends sleeves of rain. He measured our silences with chalk and thread, smiling like tide. He pressed a thimble into my palm, cool and promising, for stitching long afternoons. He said softly, "Maris chose 2 buttons made of cloud, light enough for vows." At noon the school children paraded with paper boats and cinnamon pockets. They asked us to name the flotilla with a gentle word, wide enough to float. Maris whispered harboring, and I whispered listening. The boats accepted both like twin oars and bobbed in agreement. A light rain applauded with silver fingers and then wandered off. In the afternoon we climbed the dune with a quilt and oranges. Clouds drifted like paragraphs catching their breath. slow and readable. Mari's peeled fruit with a tidy patience and shared each crescent. Juice sweetened the sand where her elbows rested, and bees wrote cursive. We planned nothing, and the plan held. A letter came folded as a gull wing and scented of mint. It asked for a dance at the tide line with bare feet. We rose and let the water teach our steps, small and kind. Marius counted quietly in another language, perhaps weather. I followed the commas her ankles made and learned to pause. That evening the keeper delivered a small clock without hands. It kept time by listening to windows and waves. We set it on the mantel beside a jar of hush and rosemary. The room settled into a warm grammar of chair and cup. Our breaths moved together like a sentence that knows itself, unhurried and sure. Night brought a thin fog that braided our street into soft corridors. We walked with our shoulders nearly touching, carrying lantern vowels. Marius told me a story about a town that sang when it rained. Each roof learned one note and held it, tender and true. By morning the streets wore lullabies like shawls, and no one hurried. We met the baker before dawn to fold loaves into envelopes. He taught us to score gentle messages in crust, barely seen. We wrote "Stay kindly" on 6 warm breads, then listened. The ovens breathed their amber wisdom, and the words softened. We carried one loaf to the lighthouse for the lens to taste. At the point the wind practiced careful handwriting, looped and patient. We broke the bread and shared it with gulls and horizon. Marius placed a crumb on the plaque, and the brass warmed. I placed a crumb on my tongue and it spoke of windows. The sea answered with a lavender pulse, small and promising. Afternoons learned to open like letters, even when blank. We filled them with laundry lines and slow ink and porch light. Neighbors brought chairs to the curb and swapped tides like recipes. Someone strummed a guitar with mittened fingers, and time obeyed. Marius taught the melody to a jar, which kept it safe. One twilight, a rumor of distant storms arrived, humble and blue. We walked the jetty and listened for worry, but heard only patience. A bottle nudged my shoe with a soft insistence, asking to be read. Inside was a ribbon of tide chart, inked in silver. It marked a night 2 weeks hence, for vows of staying. returning me to breath. She nodded once and the horizon nodded back, solemn and bright. We began gathering small oats from the town, gentle and useful. A fisherman promised to turn his nets kindly, and a child promised to share tide glass. We chose the cove where our first 6 words waited, still warm. We strung lanterns like commas along the path, soft and clear. The keeper brought a weathered book of breaths to witness. The tailor stitched a pale thread between our wrists, loose and kind. The baker carried a round loaf named Anchor for breaking and mending. On the appointed night the sea wore lavender quietly, and lanterns breathed. Neighbors stood as softly as dunes, hands folded like letters. The moon hovered like an open palm, steady and kind. We walked the sand in measured syllables, feeling commas underfoot. The keeper opened his book of breaths, and the pages warmed. I spoke first in a voice salted by patience and tea. I promised to listen where her silence gathers and rest. I promised to mend frayed days with glass and thread, steady and slow. I promised to set a chair for weather and wait. Each sentence returned to us with foam at its feet, assenting in mild. Marius answered in a tide that knew my name and kept it. She promised to carry a small dust for me inside her sleeve. She promised to share the oar when currents soften or climb. She promised to fold our mornings like quilts, stitched with rosemary. Her words touched my wrists like warm buttons, light and bright. The keeper tied the pale thread into a loop, simple and sure. He set our hands upon the plaque of pause, claiming and calm. The town breathes as one long vowel, low and kind. The sea replied with a lavender hush, soft as bread. Somewhere a door clicked home in its frame, gentling right. We broke the anchor loaf in 4 easy quarters and shared. The crumbs told stories of windows and lamps and chairs. Children tucked pieces into their pockets for brave dreams. Fishermen tipped their hats like commas, blessing the line. The lighthouse lens turned once like a sleepy eye, pleased and warm. After the vows, the tide set down a quiet trunk, sea green and low. Its brass latch listened before it opened, bent side. Inside lay instruments for keeping tenderness, polished and ready. There was a ruler that measures patience only, not length. There were our shears that cut worry into ribbons for kites. We set the ruler on our mantle between rosemary and hush. We hung the worry ribbons in the laundry sun where breeze mended them. Neighbors clapped with mittened palms like soft thunder, brief and dear. Evening folded itself down the street, tucking indoors. Our house learned a new chord for sleeping, low and round. In the weeks that followed, the letters changed color and tempo. Some arrived in citrus yellow with weather recipes, kind and clear. Some arrived in pearly blue with lullaby diagrams, gentle and exact. One letter brought a tiny brass key, smooth as fog. Its tag read for doors that forget their hinges. Please remind. We used the key on the boathouse loft and listened. Ropes remembered their summer stories and loosened. A gull landed on the sill like a period, firm and neat. Maurice laughed and the bird approved, tilt and kindly. The harbor lifted its shoulders in quiet contentment, then settled. On market days we traded jars of hush for time and yarn. A violinist tested the air with a question and found a yes. We bought a bell as small as a thimble for gentle alerts. It rang only for kindness needing doing, never for hurry. We kept it by the door on a saucer of shell, listening always. Sometimes the world leaned a little shadowward, as worlds do. Annette tore on an unfriendly nail and sighed. A neighbor woke with a brackish sadness and sat. We brought tea that remembered fog and bread that forgave. Maurice read the quiet like a tide chart and found a gentle slack. One dawn a letter arrived with no ink, only weight. It asked us to visit the far spit before noon. We walked along seal slides and dune fennel, breathing lightly. There we found a boat made of words, stitched and tarred. Its planks were phrases sanded to velvet and true. The boat asked to carry one memory each, no more. I chose the 6 words from my first letter, still bright. Maurice chose the order grandmother stirred with, light as breath. We pushed off into water that felt like paper, unmarked and calm. The horizon drifted closer as if reading us, aloud and slow. We reached the cove that matched ours faintly, but sang. The rocks chimed like porcelain cups in cupboards, sweet and shy. A village waited with doors ajar and bread cooling. Here the letters walked on their own feet, polite and small. They bowed to us and to Maurice by name, remembering her kindness. A letter led us to a square of warm shadow and bench. On the bench sat a woman threading dawn into lace, calm and steady. She smiled in a way that steadied the air, then listened. She said your vows rang here before they formed, like rain rehearsing. Please carry our tie glass back to your shelves for nights that wonder. We accepted a bowl of blue shards warmed by sun and story. I felt our pockets glow like lantern commas, soft and near. We promised to tend the hinge between shores with patience and tea. The letter village walked us to our boat, singing lightly. The sea lifted us home with an obliging shoulder, sure and slow. Back at our cove the sky wore evening lavender, familiar and new. We set the tide glass along our windowsills and breathed. The house learned another gentle chord and held it. The bell chimed once for a kindness nearby, calling softly. We followed it to a porch with a lonely chair and stayed. Night settled with moth wings and wool edges, which we loved. We wrote our threshold letter together on braid steam and rosemary breath. It asked for patience in the long winters and small light. It promised a lantern in our ribs, always lit. The tide folded our words and returned them warmer and near. Winter rehearsed at the edge of the calendar, soft and silver. The wind learned a lower vowel and used it kindly. We hung wool at the windows like gentle curtains and breathed together. The time glass along our sills drank curly dusk, then glowed. Some nights the lighthouse clicked once in its sleep, content and near. A letter arrived wearing frost-like lace, careful and bright. It asked if we might lend a season to distance, without heartbreak. Mari's read it with her head tilted, as if listening to snow. She placed the page on her palm and closed her eyes, measuring hush. When she opened them, the room felt larger and kinder. She said some letters must be hand-carried over sleeping water. She said the violet seam needs a guardian for winter, only for a while. I heard the truth arrive like a soft cart, steady and fair. My ribs did a small weather, cloud then clearing. I nodded because staying can include leaving when trust holds. We prepared a kit of shared light and pause, nothing heavy. The keeper brought a chart that tracked comfort, not miles. The tailor stitched our wrists with a longer thread, loose and true. The baker wrapped 2 loaves in warm grammar for journeys and waiting. I filled the small bottle with rosemary breath and home. On the day she was to go, the sky was brushed pewter, pleased and calm. We walked the boards as if reciting, soft and sure. At the jetty, the boats leaned closer to learn, like pupils. Maurice pressed her forehead to mine, and the air steadied. She said it will carry our pause like a lantern and return it brighter. We did not kiss with hurry or fireworks, only warmth. We let our breaths meet and agree, like neighbors. Then she stepped into a skiff the color of hush, or light as dawn. The keeper untied the fair wind knot and released a blessing. She waved once with a smile that remembered summer and kept winter kind. Her leaving did not empty the rooms, it tuned them. I poured tea that remembered fog and daybreak and listened. The handless clock kept time by window and wave, gentle and exact. Sometimes the bell chimed for a kindness at my door, and I went. I mended nets, and stories, and mail. Nights I wrote letters to the seam, and warmed them with breath. Letters returned with her careful handwriting, salt, soft, and sweet. One letter smelled of pine and train smoke and newel. It said the far harbor tastes of oranges and snow and welcomes pauses. Another letter held a pressed moth wing, silver and sturdy. It said the bottles hum at dusk in 3 notes, and remember your name. I read her letters aloud to the lens, and it listened. The light walked the headlands with soft certainty, tracing kindness. Neighbors brought soups that sailed steam, and gentle jokes. Children left chalk sentences on the step about brave cats. At night I placed our shared thread on the sill, so distance could hold it. Winter deepened but remained the light at our shore, thanks to vows. Snow came in small folded letters and kissed the pier. I walked to the black rock and wrote her name, then mine. The sea read them and answered with a lavender breath, steady and near. I rubbed the time glass shard until it warmed and kept it in my palm. One night the bell chimed a softer note than usual, almost sleeping. A bottle rested by the threshold like a curled cat, patient and warm. Inside lay a ribbon of violet light and a single button of cloud, hers and mine. message asked me to meet the Z mid-dawn with a jar of hush. Bring one story you have not told, it added kindly. Dawn arrived with milk-colored fog and gull breath, soft and mild. I carried the jar of hush like a small moon, careful and sure. At the tide line, a low arch of light waited, smiling and still. I told the seam about the day my father taught me patience with twine and kites. I told it how I failed first, then listened longer. The seam approved with a lavender nod and opened. Through the opening, the water showed a path of warmer blue, narrow and kind. I did not step through because my vow was here, holding the light. Instead, I set the jar upon the water for a breath and back. When I lifted it, a new hush had joined the old, sweet and deep. It sounded like her footsteps on our boards, coming home soon. The days shortened into clean pearls of dusk and tea and rest. I hemmed the edges of evenings with a thimble and thread. I listened to windows count the tide and nodded. The lighthouse lens turned with a slow fondness, like a guardian on. All the while the shared thread on the silk kept warm, as if held. Then the sea changed its breathing by a half measure, just enough. I felt it in my chest like a door unlocking, quiet and bright. The bell chimed the note it used for homecoming, small and sure. The town lifted its sighs from winter mugs, smiling and ready. I walked to the jetty with no hurry, because love was close. Across the water a skiff appeared like a sentence finishing, gentling right. Mari stood in it with her scarf remembering summer and snow. Her oar moved like a careful comma, meant and kind. I raised my hand and the horizon raised one too, pleased to witness. The keeper watched from the point and approved, hat bowed and bright. When her shoes touched the boards, the whole dock exhaled and settled. We did not rush because our paws carried us like a boat. She pressed our shared button of cloud between our palms, and it warmed. We stood with foreheads together and let distance unthread, without knots. The sea folded lavender very quietly, as if blessing. We walked home on streets that knew our steps and welcomed. The handless clock listened to our windows and smiled, then agreed. We set the jar of hush on the mantel and opened it, slow and sure. The room filled with a cord of chair and lamp and breath. Mari's placed her oar by the door like a tall letter, home and ready. of staying through seasons. We promised to lend our hush to others when needed. The tide carried our words and returned a single word: continue. Spring arrived like a soft rehearsal of color and breath. Fennel lifted its green sentences by the path, smiling and tall. Boats wore ribbons of fresh paint and patience, ready to listen. We aired quilts on the rail and watched letters drift and bask. The lighthouse turned slowly as if tasting peaches, pleased and sure. Maris and I mapped a new practice for mornings, mild and steady. We brewed tea that remembered fog, then sunlight. We read one sentence from the keeper's book and listened. We wrote a small reply on steam and rosemary, keeping it kind. Our house learned the rhythm and hummed along, gentle and low. The tailor visited with a spool the color of dawn, quiet and long. He offered to hem the season lightly, so days would fit. He stitched our porch with an invisible thread, warm and brave. Now footsteps arrived like practiced phrases, clear and good. Cats approved with whisker commas and polite blanks, authoritative and calm. A new letter came sealed with a fennel frond, crisp and sweet. It invited us to a reading of winds, down shore at dusk. Bring the jar of hush and a fair wind not, said the page. We packed both with bread named Harbor and 2 cups. The path offered small clover applause, tender and green. At the reading, a semicircle of neighbors faced water, hands easy. The keeper set a brass flute to his lips and waited. When he breathed, the wind wrote itself in music, low and kind. We felt our ribs answer in gentle chords, agreeing to stay. Maris tied the fair wind knot to the flute and blessed it. Afterward, we shared bread and hush among blankets, warm and sweet. Children counted lanterns like friendly stars, bright and near. The sea rehearsed a lavender syllable at the edge, then kept it. I placed my palm over Maris's steady wrist, reading tide. We walked home by sentences of moonlight, complete and soft. On a Tuesday, a letter arrived wearing sand and sugar. It asked if we would host a small museum of pauses and thread. We cleared a front room and polished windows to listening. We labeled shelves with gentle words only, nothing sharp. Neighbors brought offerings wrapped in linen commas, proud and shy. There was a jar of evening porch much laughter, amber and soft. There was a handkerchief that once caught a brave tear and warmed it. There was a spool of thread that never tangled, only waited. We accepted each artifact with a nod, then placed it. The room learned how to hold without gripping, and smiled. A woman came with a letter that hummed slightly, like bees. She said it belonged to a man who left once, but stayed in words. She asked if we might read it aloud to water, so it could rest. We walked to the jetty and unfolded the page, careful and slow. The sea received each sentence like a shy heirloom, then quieted. That night the lighthouse lens turned one extra time, considerate and bright. We understood someone far off needed a path through weather. Mari set her oar across the threshold, like a promise. I placed the thimble beside the bell, ready to mend. We slept with our palms slightly joined and steady. Morning found a bottle resting in the rosemary, too bright and sweet. Inside lay a map of sound instead of lines, soft and exact. It marked the cove where silence breaks unfairly and needs help. We packed the jar of hush in a loaf named Anchor, then went. The sky wore a calm cardigan of cloud, reassuring and pale. The coast spoke in choppy syllables at first, unsure and quick. Mari's waded to her knees and breathed slow commas, patient and warm. I opened the jar of hush in small sips, sharing gently. The water learned our rhythm and loosened, line by line. Soon the cove reached the lower vow unsettled, like bread. We left anchor crumbs on a flat stone for gulls and luck. A child from that shore brought us a coin, punched with a star. It was a ticket for safe crossing between hushes, they said. We thanked them with a tied glass shard, blue and brave. The sea tucked the exchange into its pocket, pleased and neat. Days learned to unfurl like patient ribbons, without snag. We repaired benches that sagged with stories, then sat. We hosted small readings of weather recipes, served with tea. Children practiced tying fair wind knots at dusk, careful and proud. The bell chimed softly whenever kindness needed hands, and hands came. One afternoon, the door in the dune grass returned, face shining. It asked for a hinge made of shared breath, not brass. We set our foreheads together and counted to 12, slow and still. The air between us thickened into a bright hymn. tides, and bread. Mari saw children floating on their backs, counting shy constellations. We did not step through because the glimpse was enough. For now, we closed the door gently and the hinge sang once, bright and small. That evening as Storm rehearsed again over the cape, careful and slow. Thunder arranged its furniture with courtesy, then waited. We sat on the sill with bowls of rosemary soup and listened. Mari's told a story about waves learning lullabies from whales. My heart opened a window and let the rain in to be fed. When the storm stepped away, it left a basket woven of mist. Inside were 3 blank notebooks smelling of linen and pear. A tag asked us to record the grammar of staying for travelers. We wrote in short sentences with many commas and drasts. We kept the tone gentle as wool on wrist, cozy and wise. By midsummer the museum of pauses had grown, but never crowded. People came to borrow a hush for a night, then returned it. They left notes about doors that finally closed or opened. They drew small maps of breath between words, tender and clear. We filed everything under kindness and weather, easy to find. One twilight the lighthouse pulsed to lavender twice, then paused. The keeper arrived with an expression like good bread, warm and sure. He said a ceremony waits beyond next moonrise for letter keepers. Bring the bottle that carried your first 6 words, if it returns. We looked at each other and felt the sea listen.